Is it working now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, cool.
We'll go over it all again. Mute was pushed. So welcome to Starlight Talks. We do these every week. Starting at 7 on Wednesdays. This week we're talking about LGBTQ Intersection with Charlie. She's back.
Yay!
Next week, hopefully Alex will be here talking about ADD. So hopefully you can join us for that. If anyone has any questions, please let us know in the comments. We'll get to them eventually about anything. It doesn't have to be on topic. And please let us know about the quality of the video, sound, anything like that. Keep us informed.
Yes, please.
Welcome, Eric, Grandma, Melissa, Lillian. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a moment. All right. And remember to come back next week. And if you can't watch the full live stream, it will be saved and available on the Autism Facebook page for you to view later on if you would like to.
You just went wonky in visual.
Oh no.
Are you sure it's not just your computer?
It might just be our internet.
Well, I'm looking on the computer.
Let us know what the video quality is like.
Please. All right.
This is actually Jillian, is that how you say it? Jillian? I'm using my dad's account. Well, thanks for watching.
Yep. Mom says it's working fine.
Yeah.
It's not on the computer.
Well, it's probably your computer then.
We can hear the sound. We can hear.
That's challenging.
All right, let's get started. Charlie, you ready?
Yes, I am.
All right.
These technical things are distracting me, though. Is it okay?
Is it good? Okay.
It's fine on phone. It's not on my computer. So
Okay.
I'm not sure if anybody's computer is wonky or not.
We're hearing that there's better quality on the phone than on the computer. So if you get to a phone, it might be better quality. All right.
Can you come in?
All right.
All right. We're going to get started.
Okay. So, where to start? Let me get into the mode. All right. I'm Charlie. I am a lesbian, I guess. I was gonna say LGBT, but what? All at once? All of them at once? Yes. I am also on the autism spectrum, and this has been sort of an intersection in my own life, and I felt like for other people, it's also for other people who are on the autism spectrum and who are in the LGBT community, they find themselves having this weird intersection, and I've been noticing this sort of crossover, not necessarily crossover, this intersection between autism and being LGBT, specifically in the transgender community. I've made a lot of friends who are trans, and almost every trans person and every single trans woman that I've ever met has also been on the autism spectrum or had very autistic traits to them. I am not saying that this is a bad thing by any means. As somebody who is a lesbian and who is autistic, I think that's something to be celebrated personally, both of those things. But there is this intersection, and it made me realize something. You see, I've noticed a lot of people, they want to connect this through some sort of thing, like maybe it's a genetic link or maybe something like that. I personally don't think that's the case, or at least don't think that's the full case. I think, and I've always thought this, and this has only really confirmed a lot of my suspicion, is that autistic people have a very complicated relationship with gender. Even if you're cisgender or if you're trans, if you don't know what cisgender means, it's basically just not transgender.
It's like the same use as neurotypical. It's like not part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll notice that I do notice that a lot of people have this very complicated, very interesting relationship with gender. You especially find this happening with a lot of different people who
I found like social norms just in general, people with autism don't understand and don't follow, and that gender is like another one of those areas.
Gender is definitely another one of those areas, and I think that accounts for the large amount of transgender people who are trans. But you find this not only really there's an intersection with a lot of things that wind up being the LGBT community tends to have this intersection with people who are often viewed as otherized or something like the other. That's not to say that every single person who is viewed as, I would say, the other is necessarily part of the LGBT community, but there tends to be a bit of an intersection. It isn't just with autistic people that I notice this trend happening with. It happens a lot with people identities that tend to have more marginalization, that tend to be otherized, say non-white women. These people tend to have a much more complicated relationship with their gender and their own sexuality than, say, a straight white male might. You see this happening often in that sort of, I don't like to use this word.
Like the outsider?
The outsider, yes. I typically use the word to define this as the other, basically. The outsider is a good word too. It's basically, I never view, it's that sort of discomfort that comes with maybe being viewed as something that winds up having to be a part of your identity. For example, before I knew I was a lesbian, I never thought of myself as straight. Before I got involved in say more social justice sort of activities, I never thought of myself as white. That I always thought of myself as just a woman. And if you find that a lot of men don't even really view themselves as men, they find themselves viewing themselves as people. But this sort of overlap kind of, do I think a
autistic person has a higher chance to be in the LGBTQ community?
I do to an extent, but I don't think always. I think people who are in the sort of otherized category might find themselves being in the LGBT community a lot more. I think autistic people will find them, especially, this happens especially with them because they're often living outside of social norms to begin with. They are, we live essentially not understanding exactly the sort of labels that are often put upon us. I remember when I was younger, it wasn't that I necessarily, well, when a lot of autistic people are younger, I find that I've noticed a huge trend with them winding up hanging out usually with the opposite gender.
Oh yeah, like in elementary school, it's way more likely you'll see the genders stick to their own, where in the autistic community that's not as necessarily true as it is outside of that. So you'll see more of that mingle because again social norms are not something that is innate as it is in I guess the neurotypical. So you'll see I know my sister had a lot of friends. My twin sister had a lot of friends that were guys, and so I had a lot of friends that were guys, and we didn't think that was abnormal until other people started pointing it out. Like, why do you hang out with boys when you're a girl? And we just didn't think that was strange. And I know that's a similar story to a lot of those I met on the spectrum.
Yeah, it's strangely enough not my story personally. I never liked guys. I also never liked most of the girls. I had one friend for most of my elementary school years, and then I fell in love with a girl who I didn't even know I was in love with at the time because I was in the closet very much. But then in hindsight, I looked back on this one day and realized, yeah, I definitely had a crush on this girl. But essentially, you wind up having this sort of complicated relationship with gender because for girls, they find that I think women tend to find their identity so constricting and so honestly binding because, well, of the way that we're often forced to act. Women are often forced to grow up a lot quicker than men are. Meanwhile, men I've noticed who are on the autism spectrum tend to find that the other boys are often too rough, too playful, too not allowing of any sort of feelings to be felt, and then you tend to get that sort of bullying that comes in. And I notice a lot of men tend to, even if they don't hang out with women, they will definitely think of themselves wanting to because it's that sort of gender roles in general are very, very binding, and I think to both genders personally. Though I'm definitely going to have to say that as a woman, it's pretty hard, and as a lesbian, I find myself identifying a little bit more with women in that sort of category. It's hard for men too on the autism spectrum. But
Screen got a little wonky, guys.
all right.
Well, I'm hearing it looks good by a lot of other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's all right.
Keep going.
Yeah.
All right. Where was I?
Yeah, I remember when people asked me like what my favorite princess movie, it was always Sleeping Beauty because it had the least amount of the princess in it because I liked watching the prince slay the dragon. That was my favorite part of the movie. And like I remember playing games like Power Rangers and stuff that wasn't necessarily accepted by a lot of my friends that were girls, but I could play with my sisters and I could play with the guys. And I didn't understand why like certain people thought like they weren't allowed to do different things because of that. And to me it was just like, well, everyone's allowed to have any kind of interest they want. And so that I guess had to be explained to me that girls do this and boys do that. Like that didn't ever like that wasn't something that came to me till it was like explained.
Yeah. For me, I always got bored with a lot of the stuff that girls did.
Yeah.
That's why I only had one friend. I never liked the stuff that guys did either, because I felt like they were always too rough, and I always kind of didn't trust them a lot as a young girl, and not much has changed. But what I grew up with was mostly creating a bunch of different worlds and playing with my own sort of imagination. The types of characters I always loved as a child were always the most goth, emo sort of characters that you could come up with, like Raven from Teen Titans. I liked Azula from Avatar: The Last Airbender, even though she was a villain. I just liked any girl who kind of broke a little bit of the sort of girly girl role and was a little bit more dark and brooding. And I thought, like, that seems more masculine to me. That seems more me. And I always identified so heavily with that personally. But growing up was very difficult for me as an autistic person and as somebody who had always been sort of taught that the way sort of relationships were. I remember almost going into this sort of dissociation panic almost into when I once suggested to myself the idea that I might possibly be attracted to women. That freaked me out, and I didn't know why, and I didn't know how that was. And every time I thought about it, I just kept thinking back to my relationship. Zuko was a big character for me too. Every time I thought of that, though, I kept going back to my relationship with this one girl who I met in elementary school. I kept thinking back to that, and it was always just this flashbacks back to this one single moment when the only person who I ever really fell in love with was somebody who I didn't even know I was in love with before, and I had this whole dissociation kind of thing from it. I remember as a kid, somebody once suggested that I was possibly a lesbian, and in like middle school or high school, and they sort of did it as a joke to get under my skin, and it did get under my skin, not gonna lie, but I tried to pretend that it didn't. And then I met the gays, and then I saw them. I saw everybody being so proud of their identity, in the sense that it was almost an act of power, the sense that it was like, you can't hurt me with this identity anymore. And that was something that was really interesting to me. The whole idea, because this whole time I had this one idea in my head, and I had the same idea with autism at the same time, where it was, this identity wasn't something to be proud of. This identity was something to be ashamed of, because that's what society had always been putting into my head, whether I knew it or not, whether it was always subconscious. It was always something that was essentially the other that was being put inside of me. I had no pride over this. But when I looked at other people, I realized that I could, if I wanted to, turn this whole thing into an act of being proud. And it was a slow going. And essentially what I mean by the act of being proud is, I'm going to be myself, and I'm not going to be the label that you think I am. And in the process, I'm going to otherize you, in a sense. I am going to call, in a sense, you call a white person, and they'll find themselves being uncomfortable. You call a straight person like heterosexual or something like that, and they will get uncomfortable, usually offended and stuff like that. You call, people even get uncomfortable. My sister even got uncomfortable with the word neurotypical, because she was like, I don't want to be typical though. And I'm like, well, you are, unless you want to say you're autistic or get diagnosed, you're neurotypical. But it's like this whole idea of me using this as an act to be proud of, and almost weaponizing it against other people so that I could never be weaponized against me. It was something incredible. It was this great realization to me. It was this eye-opener. And slowly over time, I began to feel this way too. It's it is essentially the freedom of oneself. I did this the same when I realized one day, when somebody told me one day that shaving wasn't a hygienic act. And I learned this, and I was like, you're right, men never have to shave. So I stopped shaving. And that was liberating as well, in a sense, to be free of that sort of body image. Excessive skincare is not hygiene. I was liberated of that. Every single mark on my body, the stretch marks on my body, those weren't flaws. They were just marks on my body. I was liberated of that as well. Those were no longer flaws to me. The entire concept of my entire body being a flaw, which is something that all women especially are conditioned to think over time, this no longer existed to me. And I have a lot of pride in that sort of body image of myself. And now there's one thing that I do have a problem with, and that's probably dress and stuff like that. And I kind of agree that I could dress well, but in my own way, I always have to do something. If I'm going to dress like nicely and create a sort of identity for myself, I have to do it in a way that's like basically a huge middle finger to what other people want me to be. So in a sense, what I'm almost planning on doing is like, I want to dress like a man. I want to shop in the men's aisle, and I want to explore my identity through that way instead of through the idea that I have to dress well like a woman. I'm not going to do makeup. I'm going to dress like a well-dressed man. That's what I want to do.
I have a very different experience with the way I looked at relationships. Like for me, it was never something that I thought about a lot. Like it doesn't really cross my mind, and so I identify more with asexual, and like that's not something that I put effort in and don't really care about. And it's like when I was little, I didn't understand what the word crush meant. And once I thought it meant that's like a cool person that I want to be my friend. And so I told people I had crushes on people that I didn't have crushes on. And so I guess I came across very straight when I like didn't at all care about being in a relationship with them, just because I didn't understand what people were asking, because I didn't understand that people were thinking about having a relationship all the time, and that was important to a lot of people, because it wasn't ever important to me, and it still isn't. And so I even sometimes forget that I am part of the gay community, because I just don't think about relationships and about that sort of thing.
Yeah, there is that sort of crossover where I do think that also tends to be a lot of the identity issues when it comes to autism. I think autism definitely affects this in a way. One thing, it all comes back to this sort of identity issue. But there's actually something that I just saw that I kind of want to comment on.
Okay.
YJ Lee. Unfortunately, there are just some that do make the LGBT look bad. I am pretty sure this will be a lot less stigmatized. However, there are some social norms that will continue to be held in society. Okay, so let's unpack that comment, because I actually want to unpack the idea of making a community look bad. And this happens a lot when you often see, I've noticed a lot of people in the transgender community specifically look down on young people trying to explore their own identities in different ways, and say that they're just basically trending and making it into a fad. And I could never agree with the idea that anyone could make the LGBT community look bad. The thing is, we already look bad in the eyes of many people. If some teenager doing something
Teenagers themselves
Obnoxious.
already look bad.
Obnoxious in the LGBT community is enough to make somebody stop supporting the LGBT community, then I'm going to say that person never really supported us to begin with. That the idea that one single person can make an entire community look bad is it's such a way to turn us all against each other.
I feel like with a lot of groups, like people think of the extremists rather than just like the normal person, because they get more publicity because they're doing outrageous things, instead of thinking about like, well, there's just people walking down the street who you wouldn't even think about, who are part of that community but aren't just talking about it all the time. And that goes with any community. Right.
Yeah. And for the second part of that question, comment, there will still be some social norms that will continue to be held in society. How do you know that? Can you see into the future? I don't have that power personally. I don't know what's going to change or what social norms will be held in society.
Social norms have changed dramatically over time. I mean, just like 100 years ago, it was so different. And with time, that's a short amount of time.
We don't know I don't know what social norms are going to be held even 10 years from now. Yeah. I'm not sure.
If we'll regress or progress, or like what you think those terms mean.
I would refrain from saying that there are some things that will always be permanent in society, because the moment you start to say that anything is permanent, I'm going to have to disagree with you there, because nothing really stays. We're in a changing world right now.
I mean, just how long ago we didn't have the technology we do now, and how social norms have changed, because now it's okay to text and it's not as okay to make a phone call, where just like 20 years ago you had to make a phone call. That's how you communicated. And then before that you had to write a letter. Now nobody writes letters. So like how different that is with just like technology, and then with how ideas change. So like there's always going to be changes in social norms.
And I find that it's a very pessimistic way of thinking, that some social norms will never be changed. I find that pessimistic to me, because I'm like, I want to believe in a world where things change for the better. I want to believe in a world where everybody is equal in the end. I want to believe in a world where there is less suffering, where there is less inequality, where there is less prejudice, and where there is less oppression. If I don't believe in that world, then I'm not sure why I'm even still here talking about any of this, if it's not going to make any sort of difference with anybody. I don't want to be a pessimist like that. I want to believe that things can change, and I want to believe that things can change for the better, but things can also change for the worse too. But the bottom line is things can always change.
Yeah. And living more optimistically, it just feels better. So why not try to feel better, you know?
Yeah, well, optimism is good. But back onto the whole topic of this, as an autistic individual, there was something that I wanted to sort of speak on in regards to sort of my gender and stuff like that. I can't say this exactly in the way that I expressed my roles, because I'm going to admit that I don't know exactly. I don't have a lot of memories of my childhood, but I do know that in a lot of ways I felt very distant from what I was assigned, which essentially was some doctor looked at my genitals when I was very young and decided that I was a woman, and that was going to be exactly what I was for the entire time. But I keep looking back on this, and I keep thinking, even to this day, I'm still not sure, what am I exactly? Because I'm not someone's decision who I didn't have any consent to like take part in. I'm not that, but at the same time, that label that I was given did bring up so much of who I am, because this becomes a sort of complicated relationship that I have.
Yeah,
It affected me.
Yeah.
It affected me. It affected
How
who
could it
I
not?
was. It affected how I grew up. It affected the people I was friends with. It affected the people I trusted. It affected so much about me that I just began to wonder, what exactly am I? And I've gone through a lot of different experimenting.
And no one can agree what the definition of the gender female versus male is. Is it just this is your body, or does it also affect your personality, or does it also affect your emotion? Like how, like there's no agreed upon definition about, like every person has a different definition about how encompassing gender is.
Is there a way to put together both a biologically there are parts of us, male or female parts, whether you could call them.
Well, that's
You
the
don't
difference
have-
between
you
gender
don't-
and
right.
sex, I
Exactly,
think.
and that's what I was saying. So, or trying to say better.
Yeah.
You said it much more eloquently. There's and maybe gender's the wrong word.
Because like when you
talk
talk to
biology,
a
but there
doctor,
are definitely different body parts. So how can
biology is more fluid than people tend to make it out to be as well. In the sense of chromosomes, we often simplify actually a lot of this sort of biology, especially in high school biology, to tend to mean something more simple. Science, that's this sort of science in and of itself that I believe it's so much more complicated than that.
And what I was getting at is there should be a way for them to coexist, because your shell is your shell.
and like when
I
you
mean,
talk
you're
to
born
a
with
doctor,
this
there's
body.
you
it
have
doesn't mean
to.
you're male or female, but this is the body God gave you.
Yeah.
Okay, or your parents gave you. But
I mean, if you have an issue with your body, that like you have to talk to your
and things
doctor
can be changed
about
later, but
that.
this is the body you start with.
There's different theories about that. Like,
Yeah.
what do you?
Okay, so no, I'm trying to. No, I want the answers.
I mean, talking to
Oh,
your
I don't know
doctor
the question.
privately about what your body is and how they can help you if you have an issue, but I feel like you don't really have to disclose that to anyone else in your life unless you choose to.
Fair.
So like it is important if it's a medical reason, if that's what you're asking, but other parts of your life, that's more gender than sex, right?
Right.
Yeah.
There's a difference between
Yeah.
gender and sex.
Yeah.
I agree. No.
Well, I would say it's a complicated subject.
Yeah.
But one thing I would say is, are you saying there's a difference between gender and sex? I find that a lot of people do this and say this as a way to often misgender people, in the sense that you're going to call you're going to call someone a male, or you're going to call somebody a female who doesn't wish to be called any of that.
And I think that goes back to my maybe we can change the label, in the sense of, okay, right now we say if you're born with a vagina, you're a girl. If you're born with a penis, you're a boy. I mean, that's the norm today. But maybe it's just she has a vagina.
That's sort of it. Yeah. I mean, that's
really,
it.
she.
That's it.
And I use the pronoun she. I apologize.
Don't need to.
But,
I don't care.
This baby has a vagina. This baby has a penis.
In a sense,
Because you have to accept that, at least at birth, because that child hasn't figured out who they are. So as a parent, we have to just kind of, this is their body.
And there is a difference with taking care of the different bodies and the hormones
That's what
and
I mean, yeah.
yeah.
But not necessarily labeling male and female, just body parts as a child.
mm-hmm.
Rachel, so do you want to read that?
The definition of gender and sex are kind of paradoxical. From what I understand, they do fit into binary categories, but they can be fluid at the same time. Rachel, queen.
That was beautiful.
Queen.
That's lovely.
Okay, we're gonna quote that somewhere. So, okay, we're saving that.
But yeah, they can fit into binary categories, and sometimes you require these sort of binary categories as a way to sort of almost reclaim them. But as for me, my own personal experience with things like gender and with things like sexuality, I mean, I have no desire to really change my body, but the thing is, I've always felt this sort of disconnect from who I was. It's strange. I know a lot of lesbians who go by he, him pronouns as a way to sort of disrupt that sort of idea that somebody can be a certain that pronouns have anything to do with gender, and that and to sort of disrupt the idea that in a sense, and to sort of rebel against that sort of dysphoria that even cisgender people feel, because it's true. Cisgender people, I believe, can also feel things like gender dysphoria.
And I think in the
especially women.
I hear a lot in the autism community too, the not feeling like either.
Yeah, I found a lot of non-binary people, and if you don't know what that means, that basically means it's basically people who don't wish to identify with either the categories male or female. I wouldn't call it so much a third gender as much as I would call it the refusal to identify with either the labels, and the idea of not needing a label in that sense.
Feeling they fit into either, they fit into a little bit of both, but
Yeah.
not quite one.
Sometimes neither
Or neither.
entirely.
Yeah.
But as for me, I find that a lot of me and a lot of lesbians in the community, they tend to identify. A lot of lesbians tend to identify as well as non-binary, but because of their connection to womanhood and their idea of how long they've been a woman, they keep this connection almost in the form of lesbianism. I am almost like, I'm not a girl, I'm a lesbian. That's kind of how I feel. I don't know how it's going to be in the future for me, but this is like, I'm just saying, right now I'm also at this very confusing stage where I'm not sure, but that brings very close to home. A
lot of people think if you're changing your label, that if it's like a phase that's not real, and that's not true. Like throughout your life, you go through so many different things figuring out who you are, or maybe you were actually really that at the time and you change. Like your opinions change over time, what you wear changes over time, but that doesn't mean who you were yesterday wasn't who you were yesterday. Like that doesn't make it any less genuine because you changed your mind the next day, because a year from now you're a different person. Like we change over time, we evolve, we learn new things, we learn more about ourselves, we learn more about other people and the way we want to relate to the world. Like I didn't always have the label of autism. I didn't always have the label of all different things. I didn't always wear yellow every day, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't who I used, that before I wore yellow, I wasn't genuine as myself. Like that was me, who I was before that. And it's the same thing, I think, with the LGBTQ community. If you came out as one thing and then changed your mind, that doesn't mean it wasn't real for you at the time.
Yeah, and honestly, it's always going to be complicated, and you should never ever take something as a phase. I feel like this fear often is predominant within a lot of LGBT people, because sometimes you get people who are like, well, you were just faking or something like that. No one's faking. Everyone's genuine. Everyone's genuinely trying to figure something out. But you know what? It's okay when you're in that stage. It's one thing I also want to say. One thing I always found funny about the autism label was that you get the idea that the extreme male brain is the idea that a lot of autistic people have this sort of male-centric brain that is more predominantly believed to think things that are more masculine, while and it's like very extreme in the idea that it's more nerdy and influenced by numbers. Okay, this is something that I have to say is wrong in a lot of respects. Most autistic people I know are mostly artists. So that's the first thing. The second thing is every single trans woman I have ever met, transgender women, and I've met quite a lot in my life as being in the LGBT community. All of them autistic. All of them. I have not met one who was not autistic, and they definitely probably exist. But the strangest thing is that there's a lot of autism going on in that sort of the idea that if it really was the extreme male brain, then why are these so-called male people deciding that they are actually women in the first place? And I've seen this happen so much, and it's like, it's almost a trope within the autistic community, within the trans community, for people to find that they're also on the autism spectrum, or to find that they were, at the very least, or to find that they have some sort of diagnosis about that. And I find that you can't gender a brain. This might a brain isn't. I don't think you can gender it. You can definitely give it. You can force gender into it. This happens with everybody. Definitely happened with my sister, who I know has much more body issues than I do, and all of these definitely influenced more by society than by her, because I don't think anyone is really born thinking that they're ugly. Sometimes people are born thinking that they're flawed, but I don't know. I think my sister was in that sense, but
I'd like you to talk about, because you had some really interesting thoughts about explaining yourself, and you had like some personal thoughts about that, like explaining who you are to someone who doesn't understand it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you've said about that in the past. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I personally wish that I didn't have to be understood to be accepted. And I find that with autistic people mostly, I find that in the autistic community, I find that I don't need to truly be understood in order to be respected in that sort of way, and to be accepted. It's
a really tiring emotional experience to explain who you are, what autism is, or what LGBTQ label you are, and what that means to you, and to explain that over and over, because you have to sometimes tell it multiple times throughout even the course of one day, especially like when you're new, like it's your first day of school, or like, you know, like you're like, I'm autistic, and they're like, okay, what does that mean? It's so exhausting because it can be really emotional and something you went through that's just draining. Like, you're going through explaining all these hard times I went through, memories come up, and that itself it's not that I don't want you to know me, it's I'm really tired of telling the same story, and it's an exhausting story to tell. That's why I don't want to explain it a lot of the times. I'm like, well, this is a long story that I don't feel like telling. I don't have time to tell. I'd rather be going and doing something, going to class, going to lunch, just hanging out with you. And it's personal too. So like, if you don't have that trust with someone yet to just be like, this is who I am, it can feel very invasive to have these very personal questions asked as well.
So, do you mean that, like, when you disclose?
When I disclose I have autism, and then they want to know more, or I'm asexual and they want to know more, right?
Yeah. I never disclose my issues with my gender. I say I'm a lesbian, I say I'm autistic, and I just let whatever else slide, because the gender thing goes over so many people's heads that they always just want a concrete answer, and I can't give them anything. It's exhausting in that sort of sense, but
and if you're still trying to figure out who you are, you don't have that story either.
There's also that risk that you take when you come out as gay, and it's very, very frightening sometimes. I don't like it can be frightening at certain times, but also it can just be exhausting. You see, you don't just do this thing where you come out to your parents and have this big speech and it's over. It's never, ever over. You come out to everyone you meet sometimes, and it's very difficult. And if you're like me and you do want to be openly out, because I just need to know if I'm going to be in an accepting space or if I'm not going to be in an accepting space. I need to be openly out in like places like my workplace and my school. I need to do that so I can know, and this is sort of my idea of being tough in that sense. But it's exhausting to have to come out to everyone, because I'm never out to everyone. This is probably why it would just be easier if I could maybe dress a little bit gayer, and maybe maybe then I wouldn't have to just explain it. Maybe I just have a big shirt with the word dyke on it, and that's gonna be who I am. Hi, I'm Dyke.
Just if you could be the stereotype, just like, then I don't have to explain myself. You just know. And there's like a lot of people who like, well, I just don't disclose. Like, there's a lot of celebrities who will be like, don't ask me that question, I'm not going to answer it. And I get why, because like every interview will be like, well, tell us about that, instead of like who they are as a musician or an actor, or and that's not the story they want to be telling. And it's not information that everyone needs to know. That's personal information. And so it's very exhausting, and it can be scary, and it can be so many different things. And it's no one's business except who you want to tell it to. You should never feel like you have to tell anyone that sort of thing. And it could just be like one of those reasons that someone's in the closet. They just don't want to tell people. Not that they're afraid of being judged or other things. It could just be like, I just don't want to talk about it.
It's the exhaustion.
Yeah, I'm just tired.
Coming out to my parents about stuff like my gender issues is really difficult for me. Not because I knew that they weren't going to be accepting, but because I just didn't think they would get it. I didn't think any of them would understand. And to an extent, I was kind of right. But They're accepting, though, I think. But it's very difficult when you understand yourself and you want people to know, but it's like at the same time, it's like maybe you don't want people to know, because it's at the same time, everyone's just going to ask a bunch of dumb questions that you don't want to hear. And it's like...
For me, I think it makes a difference when people see the difference, where whatever the label is, with autism, people really accepted the label of autism when they saw me improve because I knew I had autism, and because I could deal with problems I couldn't without knowing that. And I think it's the same thing when you suddenly know you're gay, you can overcome issues that you didn't even know you had, because you just like, oh, that's an issue because this is who I am, and I wasn't accepting that, and now I can. Suddenly, then you see a happier person, whether that's your friend, your child, or whoever it is. You're like, okay, that makes sense why they were so unhappy and why they had these issues. So now I can accept it. Where like when you first say, oh, I just have autism a lot of time, or I'm gay, it's like, well, I don't think so, because I haven't seen you act on it. But then when you see that difference that happens in the life, then it's like, oh, I accept it.
Should I address this comment?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on labels that are not necessarily based on genders? Is there a limit, since one sex at birth is either female or male, to be an objective fact determined by chromosomes inherited, while gender appears as subjective as it is based on one's perspective and experiences? All right, I'll go through this one by one. What are your thoughts on labels not necessarily based on genders? Is there a limit? I don't know exactly what you mean by labels. You mean gender labels or like sexuality labels? I'll go on this.
Or just
labels about gender. I don't care. I don't care what people choose to do. They can do whatever they want. It's not my business. It's not really anyone's business. There is one thing though that I have to say, and it's on the idea of different ways of sexual attraction that sometimes people tend to create for like different ways that people are sexually attracted to people. This is mostly because I once saw the sexuality label of dreadsexual. You see, this sexuality was sort of something was like somebody who experiences sexual attraction and hates it and is like very traumatized by it. It was like, that's trauma. That's not a sexuality. That's genuinely trauma. You need to get that fixed. Yeah. That's not something you should be proud of. That's something you should be actively like seeking therapy for. And so I'm like,